Verið velkomin að seinni hluta fyrirlestrar Suzanne Humphries efnið leyndar staðreyndir bólusetningar og aukaverkanir þeirra.
So in order to understand how immune systems are affected, we have to understand how immune systems function. Look at how the body deals with illness in a stepwise progression. I'll explain this in a minute. A person's first experience with a natural infection usually happens through one of the linings of the outer portion of the body, such as the nose, the throat, the lungs, or the gut. And most diseases have a period of days and sometimes weeks before people seem sick and then recover. Most microbes we are met with never make us sick at all, even though they have full capacity to kill us under certain circumstances. So why is this? It has to do with the effectiveness of every level of immunity represented on this picture, which vaccinologists did not understand until very recently. So let's look at frame one. This is part of the immune system that you have whether you've been infected with anything or whether you've had a vaccine or not. And this is part of what we call the innate immune system. And this is available immediately upon contact with any microbe. And it consists of your good microbes on your skin and your throat and your intestines that kind of outcompete the pathogenic microbes. So this is basically your probiotics and your normal microbes. And right underneath, you can see there's kind of the palace guards, like macrophages and something called dendritic cells that are ready to attack if anything gets through this barrier. And there's also some local chemicals, like the skin actually secretes antibiotic, and even the salt on the skin actually has antimicrobial qualities. So if something breaches this barrier, like it does here, then these cells here can take care of the problem. You might get a little bit of localized heat, say if you cut yourself or if you have an infection in part of your throat, but you won't have a fever. This is just localized, and then your body can take care of it and you can recover and you can be done. Or it can go deeper. And here what we see is that the microbes have gotten in deeper past this level, and we can see that the next level is starting to come through and go to battle. And here's where you'll start having fever because certain chemicals are being secreted by the white blood cells and the inflammation that's being created. And you're going to start to initiate what I call adaptive immunity, what's commonly known in immunology, where the lymph nodes get involved, and then you can have memory to whatever this infection was if you see it again. And then this is where full-blown adaptive immunity comes in, where you're starting to make memory T cells as well as antibody against this. So this can happen from an infection or from a vaccine, okay? So the oldest plague of sailors, called scurvy, is actually vitamin C deficiency at its worst. But even today, I see people with the bright red gums or the other signs and symptoms of vitamin C deficiency. So these people that we even see today are actually sitting ducks for illnesses and bad outcomes because vitamin C is crucial to every step here that I just described. It's crucial to your probiotics, to these cells being fueled with what they need, to being able to heal up after you've been invaded, and for these actually to give the body what it needs when it has a fever so that it no longer needs a fever. So in the mid-1900s onward, most cases of measles never got reported in most countries because they were so mild and they were an expected part of childhood because of all the improvements in society and better nutrition that I just outlined. So let's look at how the natural measles virus works. It works its way into the body slowly. And the reason I just showed you that diagram before this is because it's going to help you understand this. And I'm going to go through something slightly similar to that afterwards. So by the end, you should get it. So the natural measles virus goes into the body slowly, and it goes in over an incubation period of 14 days. And during this time, the spread of the virus is contained and limited by the need for different receptors to enter into different compartments, okay? So the measles virus that you breathe in can really only get in if there's a receptor called CD150. So the virus enters initially. If this was darker, you could see. Can we cut the lights out just for a minute so you can see this? because any slide that's white in the back, you're not going to be able to see. Yeah. Oh, it still doesn't help. Okay. So this slide here just has a kid with just a few dots, okay? So it's showing that they're inhaling the measles virus, and there are cells in the lung that are going to be able to take up this virus and bring it farther into the body. And after initial multiplication in the lymph nodes near the lung, measles can then enter the bloodstream, and then it spreads out to all the lymphoid organs like the spleen and all these lymphoid organs throughout the body. The thymus, the appendix, the tonsil, and the lymph nodes. And then it uses another receptor called Nectin-4 in order to get back through the skin and back through the lungs and to be able to cough out again. And by then, the infected person can cough the virus all around. But all that time that the natural measles virus is driving deeper into the body, those frontline defenses that I went over on the previous slide are still working to kill viruses, to hold them back, to control the spread, and to mop up the cells that have died and the mess that's created from this infection. So you can see how the three layers shown again here in a different way are very important. Again, here we have the initial innate immunity, which comes 0 to 4 hours. This is your probiotics, your skin chemicals. And so you start with infection, and at any point you can recover and get out of this. So these are non-specific preformed chemicals that can remove the infectious agent. And if that doesn't work, and that's still going to keep working, if you go to the next level, this level still keeps going. So you get to the second level 4 to 96 hours later, your infection continues, you start bringing in other cells, T cells, activated cells, helper cells, and they recognize different pathogens during this problem, and as well as inflammation. And you can either get better here, or you can go down to the next level. And with measles infection, you're usually going to go down to the next level. And so this is late, this is over 96 hours later. You'll transport this antigen, the measles virus, to different lymphoid organs that I showed you before. And at this point, there's going to be recognition by untrained B cells and T cells. Now remember, B cells are going to make antibody, and T cells have all different kinds of functions. Some of them are communicators, and some of them can munch up cells on their own. And then what happens after they're naive, they go into the deeper into the body, and they create clones of themselves that can go to battle and deal with the rest of this invasion by the measles virus. And at the end, you'll have cell-mediated immunity, which is commonly called Th1, which is really important to being able to have long-term memory immunity against the measles virus. And you can usually have some Th2 antibody immunity, but you don't actually need it. It's just part of what happens. It's more of a marker of what happened in the body. It actually feeds back into the cell-mediated immune system, kind of shutting it off so it doesn't go out of control. So if you have a stepwise natural infection, you start here, it goes deeper, all the layers are going at once, okay? They knew none of this when they invented the vaccine, by the way. Here's where a vaccine starts, right around here. So you don't have any of this or this. You're going right past the skin, right past the barriers, and you're injecting the virus into the muscle. And then you go through this step. And you do get both of these, but obviously it's not long enough, because it's not the same as having a natural virus. So a child needs to have the first two layers here working really well, because they control and slow down viral multiplication and the speed of access into the body. The first two layers and the cell-mediated immune response in the third layer are the key to both efficient control and clearance of the virus. As noted before, children with no ability to make this Th2 antibody get through the measles just fine, so long as the first 2.5 layers are working properly. And what's more, they do have long-term immunity. Researchers were surprised to find that they didn't get measles again when they were exposed. So if anything goes wrong in these 2.5 first layers, then your child will be in trouble, no matter what century they live in. We hear a lot about what can go wrong with measles disease, but the medical system hasn't had any real appreciation for those 3 layers above, because their focus revolves around lots of antibodies. The reason these 3 layers are important to understand when it comes to the measles vaccine is because the vaccine enters the body in a different way than the natural virus does. First off, the vaccine isn't inhaled, and instead of following the same sequences as the disease and gradually allowing stepwise, body-wise access starting at the lung surface, the vaccine goes past the physical barrier defenses, and this is the key, it uses a different receptor called CD46. And the reason for this is because of how it was passaged in order to attenuate it on these monkey cells. It gave it the attraction to this CD46, which allows access to every nucleated cell in the body at once, bypassing the top 2 layers of that stepwise immunity that's seen in natural infections. Because the vaccine bypasses those first 2 layers, you can have a disaster if the vaccine is not highly attenuated or weakened. And that's exactly what happened with the first live measles vaccines in the USA that I talked about earlier. They were not attenuated, and so they created serious illness. And doctors were actually afraid to give them without also injecting gamma globulin at the same time to stop the serious systemic disease symptoms that resulted from instant access to the whole body. The only cells in your body that are not nucleated are mature red blood cells. This also creates an inferior immune response. So in 1965, they had no idea that the vaccine cell cultures had led to a mutation which changed the entrance capacity of the vaccine virus. All they saw was that people were getting serious measles after being vaccinated. Sometimes more, actually oftentimes more serious than when they got natural measles, and now that should make sense to you. And this happened until they made a more highly attenuated vaccine in the 1970s and 1980s. In 1965, virologists knew that surviving natural measles provided lifelong immunity. And you've seen here, locally I should say, in the Faroe Islands natural experiments, the same thing. And if you don't know what happened, I think it was in the 1700s or 1800s, the Faroe Islands had their first big epidemic of measles. And there was a 25% mortality rate, and that's pretty high. And then the people that survived that went on, and there were no more circulation of measles until 65 years later, when another ship came in with an infected person. And it turned out that all those people who had experienced measles initially were not susceptible even to the second round, even though there was no ongoing circulation of measles virus. Because natural infection provides lifelong immunity, scientists assumed that vaccines would do the same thing, because they knew nothing about measles receptors, the layers of the immune system, or how measles progressed through the body. They thought that sticking a needle in the body would give that same solid lifelong immunity. Because yesterday's settled science turned out to be wrong, today there are pockets of vulnerability in the vaccinated and in the unvaccinated. In the vaccinated, there are bigger problems because it's not possible to achieve lifelong solid immunity in them for all of the reasons I just outlined. And unlike in the past, where measles was mainly in children, today we now have to be aware that everyone vaccinated could get measles somehow, sometime later, as Dr. Gregory Poland and the Chinese doctors are saying, instead of seeing it in toddlers like we used to, we're now seeing it in very young babies and in older people. So the pockets of susceptibility in the vaccinated are as follows. The primary failures, which as Dr. Poland says, 2 to 10% of all people who get a vaccine who don't respond to their vaccine. The secondary failures, which can be described in different ways based on which studies you're referring to, but 8.9 to 19% of people between 4 and 11 years after their vaccines will not be able to respond to the virus. Secondary failures over 20 years, they find that 33% of vaccinees lack protective titers. And then we have the new and very small, minor beginning of a problem of vaccine escape mutants that's being seen in China. So in the unvaccinated, we see pockets of susceptibility primarily in the medically exempted children and in babies that are too young to be vaccinated. However, if an unvaccinated child gets measles infection, they'll have lifelong immunity, which a vaccinated child doesn't get, unless they have lifelong vaccines. However, a much larger group of susceptibles will be the vaccinated older children and adults who have lost their immunity. All this as a result of a medical system which once thought that one shot would stop measles the year after the program started and provide immunity for life, just like the disease does, and a public who accepted their version of settled science. In 2015, we saw outbreaks in California where cases of measles occurred in individuals who were fully vaccinated. Today, not only are all children getting 2 shots of measles, mumps, rubella, but adults are being told to revaccinate because their immunity has worn off. There's an obvious problem when we see the proportion of infected people from California who were vaccinated. There's also a problem when we compare to what happened in the pre-vaccine era, when 95 to 99% of people had lifelong immunity to measles by their 15th birthday, and infants less than 1 year old almost never got measles because their mothers protected them because they had been immune naturally. But look how many less than 1 year olds and older than 20-year-olds were infected in California. We have a problem here. Babies receive a weaker immunity from their vaccinated mothers. Community immunity in vaccinated populations is fragile, and it's only going to become more tenuous as the older people with lifelong strong immunity die off. But you're not supposed to think about that. You're just supposed to believe what you're told. In order to keep the rates of MMR vaccine up, you're told that measles is deadly, or better yet, measles is not deadly, but it erases memory immunity for 2 years after you're infected. That's a paper that came out in 2015. And according to that theory, measles disease also threatens herd immunity to all the other diseases, and your baby could die, or your baby could kill someone else's child. This theory, of course, says that it's the vaccine refusers who are causing all this trouble. The reality is that in outbreaks, the vaccine refusers are only one part of the susceptibility equation. I wonder what would have happened in Disneyland if everyone there had been adults. Since we're talking about measles, which is part of the MMR, we also need to consider the facts behind an ongoing case in the USA of 2 Merck vaccine virology scientists who filed a lawsuit in 2010 over Merck's efforts to allegedly defraud the United States through Merck's ongoing scheme to sell the government a mumps vaccine that is mislabeled, misbranded, adulterated, and falsely certified as having an efficacy rate that is significantly higher than it actually is. Merck allegedly did this from 2000 onwards in order to maintain its exclusive license to sell the MMR vaccine and keep its monopoly of the US market. The scientists outline in great detail exactly how Merck manipulated the efficacy results in order to be able to say that they had a 95% effective vaccine so that they could meet their goal of vaccine-induced herd immunity by 2010. Well, it turns out that the vaccine could not meet the goal that CDC projected to eradicate mumps by 2010 because the vaccine in its current state cannot reliably confer immunity and is in fact a dilute version of what it once was. And this is a copy of the front of the brief that you can go and read. Everything I've just said to you is stated in that brief. So 40 years of passaging through different animal cells, the same original viral strain and all the resultant mutations that happen through doing that has lowered the antigenicity, or otherwise the antibody-stimulating capacity of the mumps virus. So that we essentially have a situation of vaccine escape strains there too, but from a vaccine that's actually worn out. So you'll be disgusted to learn how Merck tried to get the vaccine virus to pass its tests. I'm not going to get into that now, but I have gotten into that in other places. 2 virologists from Merck got tired of Merck's cheating that they were witnessing day in and day out, and they filed this lawsuit that's still ongoing. And while the USA regularly has mumps outbreaks in highly vaccinated populations of teenagers and adults, even after we've doubled our vaccine rates, we used to only need 1, now we're told we need 2 or even 3. Other countries are having the same problem. In 2015, there's a report from Australia, 49 confirmed cases, with many more mild or cases that may have gone unreported. The ages of people affected ranged from 9 to 22 years, and all have received 2 prior doses of mumps vaccine. And Korea. We see an article here by Park that just came out talking about vaccine viral or immune escape happening with mumps vaccine, and high and rising, continuing to rise, prevalence in teenagers and young adults that are fully vaccinated. And they're saying that we need a 3rd dose of the mumps vaccine, and also that the new golden era of vaccinology should produce us a new and improved formulation for the mumps vaccine. But in this article was an astonishing graph shown here. And you can see the reported incidence of mumps both pre and post-vaccine. What we have over here is 1955 and over here 2013. Notice how the pre-vaccine incidence looks really low, and now it looks really high. And that's because, as the article says, most mumps cases back here were not reported pre-vaccine. And as you can see, pre-vaccine, there was almost 7,000 cases reported annually, yet the authors of this study say that they estimate that there were 640,000 cases per year. So one would wonder why so few of those cases were reported. Was it that they were so mild they weren't considered noteworthy? Could it have been that only the big lumps got called mumps? In this article, supposedly far more boys got mumps than girls did, so maybe it was swollen testicles that got the child to the doctor. But this is an important graph because in America, we're now told that rather than 500,000 cases of measles reported every year pre-vaccine, there were actually 4 million cases every year, most of which were never reported. And Dr. Park here also talks about how complications were more prevalent in the past, but it's not based on any analysis. Of the 633,000 never reported cases every year, they give us no data. And this is creative gymnastics on the part of these epidemiologists, because they have to come up with an explanation to justify their recommendations for a 3rd dose of MMR in the face of these kind of figures. And they have to convince us that this left-hand part of the graph is irrelevant because every year 630,000+ patients didn't bring their lumpy children to the doctor. And to cover their backside in the case that this backflip gymnastics doesn't score, they increased their options by talking about genotype mismatching being something else that needed addressing. And we hear the same thing going on with other vaccines. So you can see how the Korean vaccine immunity starts to break down in the 1980s as the different vaccines were failing. And you can see that no matter the virus strain that was used, that the mumps vaccine has problems. And meanwhile, in the USA, Merck is dragging out the whistleblower case as long as they can, perhaps until vaccines are made mandatory for everyone, at which point discussion would become academic only, and perhaps they might have a new improved mumps vaccine to whip out to make the court case seem redundant. Merck's Department of Risk Management is never without optional legal or business strategies. Realistically though, The last thing Merck wants is the public to know now that science in the world of Merck vaccines means throwing out results that don't fit their desired outcome, inflating new results, and throwing out the evidence before the FDA comes to inspect. This is all described in the legal brief. And offering bonuses to scientists who deliver the necessary results, and actually telling them that if they call the FDA, they could be thrown in jail. But what do you expect when you have the vaccine manufacturers in charge of proving that their own vaccine is potent? Science in the general vaccine research world includes placebos that are vaccines or carrier fluid with aluminium, studies done on healthy people, and then under optimal circumstances, and then those results are applied to everyone no matter how sick they are. I knew none of this as a nephrologist, because the system makes sure that they educate medical students in such a way that we don't even think to look for information that might warn us that all is not well with these one-size-fits-all vaccines. Yet that information was right under my eyes had I known where to look. What I've discovered is that there's almost too much information that puts vaccines into question, not that there's not enough. So we'll take a break now. And after the break, we'll have a look at the whooping cough vaccine. All right. I told you we would talk about whooping cough next. So, I don't know if the Vaccinate All Grandparents has arrived in Iceland, has it? Yes. So, if not, I was going to say that it will. In the USA, the media is saturated with this advertisement, maintaining that if grandma doesn't have a whooping cough vaccine, that her whooping cough could eat your baby up. What they don't tell you is that the vaccine only has the potential to stop you, the vaccinated person, from coughing for a short time. But if you contact whooping cough, you can carry it without symptoms for 6 weeks and spread it to the baby. This is a trend which has accelerated and largely been caused by the acellular or more modern whooping cough vaccines, which, like the flu vaccine, also primes the immune system the wrong way. And that's why whooping cough is now having such an uncontrolled reappearance, at least in the United States. Are you having high rates of whooping cough here as well? No, okay. Sometimes, you know, these trends take time. As shown in the graph here from the USA, you can see how after the original DTP vaccine, this was the whole cell vaccine, the disease did seem to go down. But part of this would be short-term efficacy of the vaccine, so we'll give it credit for that. But another part is the unwillingness of doctors to diagnose whooping cough in fully vaccinated people. The other part is bias in that only the unvaccinated used to be tested, because it was assumed that only the unvaccinated caught whooping cough. And that's what a pertussis expert named Dr. James Cherry called observer bias in one of the whooping cough review articles. So it's also obvious that the DTaP, the acellular vaccine era, saw a rise in whooping cough incidence. And this is because of the inferior effectiveness of that vaccine. And also because more sophisticated testing later became available. The suspicion among doctors is higher now because they're having to justify using so many boosters today. And they also realized that they're being vomited on by so many more vaccinated whooping cough cases than unvaccinated whooping cough cases. So the DTaP vaccine is now well known to only have a very short period of protection, which is why we're told we need so many shots. These are cases of pertussis in California in 2010. And the orange bars are people who had between 1 and 4 doses of vaccine, and most of them will be 4 doses. And yellow represents people who had 5 doses of vaccine. So children have a basic 5 doses, And there's talk of adding another adolescent dose. Pregnant women are now vaccinated during every single pregnancy because the vaccine antibodies in a pregnant woman disappear within 1 year. So say a mother has 6 children, which is not that uncommon in America. And that's 6 more DTaP vaccines on top of her 5 childhood ones. And grandparents are now supposed to be vaccinated with every grandchild's birth as well, because they too lose their antibodies within a year. So if this mother, who has 6 children and 11 DTaP shots, then lives longer, and her 6 children each have 6 grandchildren, which makes 36 grandchildren, the poor grandmother's life will be that of an annual needle cushion. So do the math on this. It's not extremist, it's true. So if grandma survives the shots, she might have over 40 shots by the time she dies. Which could bring with it the prickly problem of what happens in a person who is hyper-immunized with the tetanus vaccine, but that's a whole other story, but I did talk about that last year in Sweden in my tetanus talk. What doctors don't tell you is that people who had whooping cough disease naturally get solid immunity, and if they contact whooping cough, they immediately throw the bacteria out. I'll explain this in a minute. They don't carry the bacteria, and they can't spread it. Their immunity is also known to last longer, around 30 years. Why does it last longer? Because it's much more complete, and it's an immunity which is activated through all 3 of those layers of the immune system I showed you earlier, and not just the last antibody layer that you get with a vaccine. What I want to show you here is a graph from Dr. Warfeld's paper of 2014, where he basically showed that these baboons, which mimic whooping cough, just very similar to humans, they are protected for a short period of time after they're vaccinated. However, if you look over the long term, and then they're re-exposed to the bacteria, something really interesting was observed, which is what you need to tell your neighbors who won't let their kids play with your unvaccinated kids. This is what they need to learn. So the blue curve here is somebody who is what we call naive, and they get infected with the bacteria naturally. And as you would expect, the count of bacteria in their lungs is quite high in the beginning. They're very symptomatic. Everyone knows they're sick. They're kept home, okay? And while they're home, over about 38 days, those counts will go down in the lungs, and they'll get immunity for 30 years. So let's now look at that person if they're re-exposed to the bacteria within that 30 years. What you get is this line down here. This is your unvaccinated child who has had whooping cough, recovered, and then is re-exposed later. And as you can see, there's no culturable bacteria in their lungs at all. Now, let's compare them to a vaccinated person who has been re-exposed to the bacteria. The red line here is the vaccine that we're currently using today, the acellular vaccine. And so if an acellular vaccinated person is then exposed to the bacteria, what happens is they may not cough at all. They may not show any symptoms. But what they have are colony counts in the lung that at some points are actually higher than somebody who has an acute version of the disease. And they are basically carrying the bacteria in their lung for 6 weeks, just like we showed you in that grandma photo. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, don't you think? So we have to think of it as re-exposure to circulating bacteria, which, let's just face it, they're everywhere. You can find whooping cough just about anywhere. So the vaccinated people don't throw out the bacteria that they carry for a long time. And they're a reservoir for another problem that has been building for the last 10 to 15 years or more. And the reason is that their immunity didn't happen at the lung surface. Remember how the measles vaccine immunity starts at the lung surface, and then we have those 3 layers, and then they get that long-term, lifelong immunity. Well, there's a similar phenomenon with whooping cough in that if you're vaccinated, your immunity starts in the muscle, not at the lung surface. So it makes sense here when you think of it that way, doesn't it? So the problem I alluded to that has been building for 10 to 15 years or more is that of mutated strains of the bacteria. And an Italian group first examined this issue in 1999. Are you starting to see a trend here? Mutated trends, strains, vaccine relationship? Okay. An Italian group first examined this issue in 1999, and they analyzed which populations had the most mutant strains, and it was the vaccinated. So Dr. Mastro Antonio looked in 1999 at these what are called protactin deficient strains. This is a mutant strain of the bacteria that doesn't have this little hook on it called protactin. And they found that it's far more prevalent in the vaccinated and far less in geographical areas of low vaccination. And in 2014, after an epidemic in Washington State in the USA, the same thing was noted. What this amounts to is that the vaccinated are breeding mutant strains of bacteria because they are the asymptomatic group that doesn't remove the bacteria immediately. And so the bacteria has time to work out strategies around that vaccine-induced immunity that's mostly in the blood and not in the lung. And this is a serious problem which doctors aren't talking about, but which needs discussion. The acellular vaccine's failure to prevent colonization or growth in the lung has been reported in numerous publications. And here's Dr. Warfel again saying, the observation that acellular pertussis vaccine, which induces an immune response mismatch, that's the polite term, to that induced by natural infection, fails to prevent colonization or transmission, provides a plausible explanation for the resurgence of pertussis and suggests that optimal control of pertussis will require, guess what? Development of improved vaccines. So again, improved vaccines are being called for, and the same problem is happening in Finland. In 2005, the whole cell vaccine was replaced by the acellular vaccine, and very quickly, these mutations started to occur in vaccinated people. In highly compliant Finland, the vaccination coverage has been more than 90% since the 1970s. But the problem is also discussed in Australia, Japan, and France, and probably it's worldwide at this point, wherever the DTaP vaccine is used. So you might think that the loss of a virulence factor, or that hook that holds the bacteria onto the lung, is a good thing, but it's not. These new bacteria, which come about from mutations in the lungs of vaccinated people, actually have increased invasion ability. Dr. Stefanelli in 2008 reported the enhanced ability of the PRN negative or protactin negative strain to invade, infect human dendritic cells. Those are the cells in the lung that are supposed to be protecting you. And they said 5 hours after infection, those strains had significantly increased invasion ability. So protactin mutation isn't the only problem. Vaccination also selects for increased virulence from higher toxin production as well. Now remember, the whooping cough bacteria is, it's a nasty bacteria that has several toxins and a factor that's like a force field that fools your immunity into thinking it's not there for 2 weeks. And so I'm not saying that whooping cough is a walk in the park. What I'm saying is that the vaccines are ineffective, that they're breeding mutant strains, and what I have found in my own practice is that treating whooping cough becomes extremely much easier if you know how to use vitamin C at high enough doses constantly throughout the illness, even in very young babies as young as 2 weeks old, okay? So you still can have a long cough, but it won't be the kind of cough that's going to stress you out day and night. So this problem is a direct result of faulty immune priming by the vaccines offered to babies and everyone else as boosters. So that's a summary of 4 vaccines, measles, mumps, flu, and pertussis, that are supposed to provide herd immunity, but only have failed to the point that new ones are being developed. However, there's another important fact that's overlooked in this discussion, and that is that just like Cowling showed that the current influenza vaccines are known to cause other respiratory diseases as a result of immune system skewing, so do the DTP vaccines and other types of inactivated vaccines. Remember, there's two types of vaccines. There's live viral vaccines, and there are the dead or inactivated vaccines. So a Danish researcher named Dr. Peter Orby talks about this problem more than any other scientist. And most doctors are totally oblivious to the fact that all killed vaccines can set the immune system at a disadvantage to fighting other diseases in the long term. And many studies from Africa showed the marked negative effects of this DTP vaccine, either alone or after a live vaccine. And all the references are here. This talk is videotaped, so if you miss anything, just know that in a couple weeks you can go back and get all the references and listen again. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail because we're running short on time. But what he basically showed is that they had baseline levels of death rates, long-term death rates of babies before this DTP vaccine came in. And then they were able to check the long-term death rate after the vaccine came in. And what he found was that there was a twofold increase in the death rate after the introduction of this vaccine in certain African countries. And that hospitalizations increase when this vaccine is the last vaccine given. And I'm just going to show you some of the studies. Here's a recent African study that went one step further and showed that administering both live and killed vaccines together was far worse than administering live vaccines only. The death rate was appallingly high for the killed plus live vaccines versus the live vaccines only. So what we have here is a bunch of vaccines that are killed and two that are live. And this is the death rate over long term for those. And what we have down here is just for measles and yellow fever, two live vaccines. And the long-term death rate after those were given is markedly lower. And the authors weren't happy at all. And they noted that putting live and inactivated or killed vaccines together increased the death rate between 6 and 329% compared to just giving the live vaccines. So the African schedules are now starting to follow the lines of the schedules in Western countries. So it's logical to ask what happens in Western countries. And up until 5 years ago, believe it or not, Western countries' studies never looked at what Dr. Orby was looking at in Africa, what the long-term death rates or hospitalization and sickness rates were after vaccination. But because Dr. Orby is based in Scandinavia, those countries are now at the forefront of the research. And results so far show that inactivated vaccines used in Europe negatively affect immune systems, raising hospital admissions similar to the way they do in Africa. And the first study I want to discuss is a 2015 study in Denmark, which looked at 168,511 children. And what they looked at was whether this group of killed vaccines at 3, 5, and 12 months of age, and then they got the live vaccine, MMR, at 15 months. And there were no unvaccinated controls. And what they asked was, does the type of last vaccine given affect the hospitalization rate for a disease called respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, in Denmark? And the answer is yes, it does. Having the live vaccine as the most recent vaccine was associated with a reduced rate of that lung infection, hospital admissions, but having the killed vaccines as the most recent vaccine resulted in an increased hospitalization. So on the basis of this finding, parents can logically and correctly state that those killed vaccines, DTaP, the inactivated polio vaccine, and Haemophilus influenza B vaccine, puts their child at an increased risk of other infections during the period that their immune system is affected by that vaccine's program. And once again, there were no unvaccinated controls, and there should have been some information on them if they're getting infected too. We're just left guessing. But the proposed solution to the killed vaccine problem is to give more live vaccines. and to consider giving them at a younger age. So why might the earlier administration of MMR live vaccine be more beneficial? Because they know that the inactivated vaccines result in higher hospitalizations during the time that they're affecting the immune system. So it should be obvious to anyone that killed vaccines are a problem. Now, I talked to probably 10 people from this audience today who came up to me and told me that their unvaccinated children have never required antibiotics, don't have ear infections, and are ridiculously healthy. And I've talked to parents who have said they have older vaccinated kids who were sick all the time, who had ear infections, antibiotics, and their younger kids who aren't vaccinated are completely different. And so you can understand possibly how that can be happening. So it should be obvious to everybody that these killed vaccines are a problem, and to study this properly, we need to study vaccinated versus never vaccinated children. But there's a reason that we can't study unvaccinated children, and there's a reason that Dr. Orby couldn't do it either when he was in Africa, and he states the problems quite clearly in his writings. And he basically talks about that there is current perception that excludes that there are these problematic effects. And he's actually wrong about that. He should have said that the current perception precludes such study of these effects because they know clearly that there's a problem there, and they refuse to study it using unvaccinated children. And all they want to do is fix the problem using more vaccines or vaccinating in a different order, given earlier, and hope that you don't notice what the real problem is. Here's another study you need to know about, which is in effect another non-specific effects trial, meaning what else happens besides stopping the target disease after you give a vaccine. So this time there were 495,987 children. And they're Danish children born between these years, followed to age 2 years of age. And what they wanted to see was the difference between having MMR or the killed vaccines as the last vaccine. And the results showed that, indeed, if the live vaccine was the last vaccine given, that the incidence of hospitalization was reduced with an incidence rate ratio of 0.86. So less than 1 means there was a beneficial effect. But if the last vaccine was a killed vaccine, giving that Th2 antibody bias, which is what killed vaccines do, hospitalization increased with an incidence rate ratio of 1.62. So this is very similar to what Dr. Orby saw in Africa. And again, there's no mention of unvaccinated baby admissions. And I keep saying, why not? Why are there none? Are there none, or are they just ignored? Their stated conclusion was the inactivated vaccines are driving an increase in illness, just the same as in Africa. So there's now lots of documentation that killed vaccines prime the immune system the wrong way, leading to an increase particularly in respiratory infections, all of which increase infection rates and spreading of disease within the community. So these are potentially serious, infectious, non-specific effects of vaccines that parents know little about. And the unvaccinated child should be studied, in my opinion, because the only normal child in the room is the breastfed, non-vaccinated child, which the designers of these studies seem obstinately unwilling to identify and to include in their studies. And that makes the unvaccinated children what I call the elephant in the room. And in my experience, and in the people in this room's experience, and in every talk that I give parents who have unvaccinated children, their experience is exactly the same, that they're the healthiest elephants in the room. And they should be calculated into all studies that look at non-specific effects and long-term health effects, especially when we're looking retrospectively, because those children can be included in these studies so easily. And the fact that all killed vaccines have negative health effects and make children more susceptible to other infections needs to be seen for the big issue that it is. And what I see is that a whole lot of other settled science is ignored in order to educate the public to achieve a predetermined behavior objective. In 1996, this article from the peer-reviewed journal Pediatrics shows you the bottom line. Policy is the most important thing.
Everything I talk about today are the concepts that you're not supposed to know because you're getting re-educated by the pro-vaccine manipulators. When these media darling doctors talk about re-educating you, they're really talking about removing from your knowledge everything the medical system considers to be non-essential concepts. This is nothing new. Parental behavior objectives are the desired health behavior and have always been the system's real endpoints. For you, the concepts I'm talking about today are the ones that put everything into its proper perspective. The information given to you by the World Health Organization, the government, and the doctor, for the most part, is carefully crafted and put together to create a picture in your mind to make you afraid. And that's done by leaving out the high-level knowledge that would counterbalance their fear-mongering. I'm just going to read you this quote in case anyone in the back can't see it. Pamphlet authors should determine the key points that the patient or parent needs to know to achieve the behavioral objective. Non-essential concepts can then be deleted. The key is to write for the desired health behavior rather than for high-level knowledge. What they consider non-essential concepts are the ones that could change the whole equation in favor of non-vaccinating. The current dominant medical system can't withstand any doubt over the vaccine program, whether or not well-founded. Neither could the system that wrote this from the Federal Register of the Department of Health and Human Services in USA in 1984. And as you go back through the medical journals, you'll see that in every era, all doubts have been forcefully squashed, and doubters slandered, pilloried, and where possible, evicted from the system. And when I leave Iceland, you will see that the same will be attempted towards me. Any doubts, which could come from me or other doctors who have studied the medical literature and history, are considered misinformation, which gives you a false perception of risk. So all of you parents who have those ridiculously healthy, unvaccinated children have been deceived and have a false perception of risk. Which brings me back to what I found out after I left the mainstream medical system, which is why the executive committee at my hospital would not stop vaccinating my newly admitted critically ill patients. It was because in many cases, the hospital stay is only paid for if new patients receive those vaccines on admission, unless there's extensive documentation justifying not giving them. There are also what is politely known as incentives to practicing doctors in hospitals, which are bonuses for having certain high vaccine rates. Right now in America, the land of the free, we have a no jabs, no pay policy at the hospital, no jabs, no school allowance, no jabs, no welfare, no jabs, no medical treatment. People are being kicked out of their general practitioner's office for not accepting vaccinations. I've seen people refused organ transplantations for refusing vaccinations. And their doctors don't want to look at any of the medical literature. So next, what will happen? Will we have no jabs and no jobs anywhere allowed? Will there one day be no jabs and confiscated children? Or like in England that we wrote about in the late 1800s and early 1900s, property confiscated, fines, and jail sentences? Who, other than the garter of the goose that lays the golden eggs, could have convinced the hospital to agree to vaccinating on day one? Why is what I still consider to be medical malpractice, scientific nonsense, and potential murder made into irrevocable hospital policy? I realize the medical system is not really about health, science, or truth. It's about policy, payment, and profit. And I look at the behavior of my hospital and the intense public fear-mongering in 2015 and believe that the real reason science and logic does not prevail is that vaccine refusal in either the medical community or the public is the thin end of the wedge or the crack in the glass. Stakeholders are reacting to the truth getting out. This trickle of refusal could turn into a stampede It must be stopped now because it could turn into a weapon of Wall Street destruction, killing those geese, laying all those golden eggs, upsetting the shareholders who feed off of them. And therefore, no doubts can be allowed to exist.